What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Babbles Nonsense podcast. Last week, I talked about a little bit about my experience working in an emergency room for 11 years, and then kind of coincided that with a new show called The Pit on HBO. Y'all seem to really like that episode, so maybe I should be talking about my healthcare experience a little bit more, which was what the podcast was intended for from the very beginning. So this week, I'm going to kind of continue that conversation based off of a listener's questions around that. So if you want to hear more about the ER experience and the listener's questions, then this is the episode for you. All right, guys, welcome back to another episode. So this is a continuance of last week somewhat. So I haven't really advertised this or discussed this a lot, but the hosting site for my podcast started a few months back allowing what they call quote unquote fan mail. And you can find that by going to the show notes on any platform, whether you're listening on Spotify, Apple, wherever you're listening, you just go to the show notes and it says send fan mail and you can send questions in that way. And they're completely anonymous. So I don't even know who it is sending them. It just gives me a state where it's coming from. So I know this person who sent in a few questions is from Tennessee. So maybe one of my high school friends that listens, possibly. So if you do want me to know who you are and your questions, definitely send them to me via my Instagram that way. But if you want to remain anonymous and you want to send in either comments or questions about episodes or something you want me to do an episode on, this is a great way to do it. You can also give me constructive criticism. Please don't be mean. We don't need that in our lives right now. The world is already in enough chaos. But if you want to give me constructive criticism or notes that you want me to do or just guests you want me to have on, it's a perfect opportunity to do that. You can still send me questions through my Instagram account. That's fine too. That's where most of my questions come from. But I didn't realize that last week's episode talking about the ER would spark so much interest and have y'all all kind of engaged. So I really enjoyed that. I actually was talking to one of my friends, Val, who's been on this podcast before, worked in the ER with me, and she would like to do a follow-up on that as well and just tell kind of stories that we've experienced. So that one would kind of be a fun one to do. So whenever we can get our schedules coincide, I think we'll do that. But anyways, that was a long-winded response to say I got a few questions about last week's, well, not about last week's episode, but to continue last week's episode talking about the ER. So I'm going to read the questions and then I'm going to kind of dive into that a little bit. So the questions were, if I could discuss how law enforcement is involved in the hospital, how do you balance the information police need to conduct their investigation versus what you need to know medically? For example, is it medically relevant to know if they've taken drugs, but the patient doesn't want to discuss that with cops? How do you handle a combative patient? And how do you handle a patient transferred from jail or prison? So we'll start with the first ones about law enforcement in the hospital. And again, when I talk about stuff like this, it is my experience, what I was told in training. And then I did do a little bit of research because I didn't want to state any non-factual information. But if you hear anything that I state that I misstate, definitely reach out. Let me know. I'm just going to read off to you part of my research, and then I'll kind of explain in examples of what we dealt with when I worked in the emergency room. So there are laws regarding police's presence in the ER depending on federal and state regulations. So each state will be different, obviously. And I am here in Alabama, so this is just from my experience here. But number one and first and foremost, there is patient privacy and HIPAA laws. So if you're not familiar with HIPAA, that stands for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And it just means that the patient has a right to their own privacy. And if people are spilling, quote unquote, their privacy, whether they're talking out in public to their friends about it, or anybody that does not need to know the information. So what they consider need to know information is the people working on you in that moment. So I'm referencing the emergency room, but this is for all healthcare. So if you're in the emergency room and you have a doctor, a nurse practitioner, physician's assistant, you have a nurse, a technician, pharmacy, consulting surgeons, whatever it may be, if they are working on your case, then they have a need to know ability with your chart. So that is not breaking HIPAA because you're sharing information with people that need to know. When you break HIPAA, it's like if I were to leave the hospital, go talk to my friend about it, say your name, your date of birth, giving patient identifying information, then that is breaking HIPAA. When you give, like if I give examples on this podcast, it's not breaking HIPAA if you're not giving patient identifying factors. So you can't give too much information where someone could go, oh, I know exactly who you're talking about, because that then would be considered breaking HIPAA. So under this HIPAA Act, hospital staff cannot disclose patient information to law enforcement without patient consent. So the patient would have to consent to do that, unless there are some exceptions, and the exceptions would be the police have a court order, a subpoena, or a warrant for your arrest, and they show that and they provide that. So then we have to obviously abide by those federal and state regulations on giving need to know information. If the patient is suspected in a crime, so like gunshot wounds are mandated reporting. And I know that it was for us in Alabama. So like if a level 1 trauma came in and it was a gunshot wound or a stab wound or something like that, and it didn't necessarily have to be a level 1 trauma. It like even if you got grazed or something like that, gunshots had to be reported because then it becomes a public safety issue. So that is reported to police and they become the need to know information as well. Other examples would be if the patient is unconscious or incapacitated and disclosure is in the best interest of public safety. So again, if it was something that was, I'm trying to think. So like so for example, it's not like if you come in with a drug overdose and you're unconscious, we're not calling the police and saying, hey, you might want to get up here. Someone had a drug overdose. We don't do that. It's only when it's like a patient safety thing or it's a need to know information. But then the second ruling in where police enforcement would be involved would be with the EMTALA and Patient Care Act. So EMTALA stands for Emergency Medical Treatment and Labor Act, and hospitals must provide stabilizing treatment before law enforcement can take custody of a patient. So for example, going back to the gunshot wound, if you are a level 1 trauma, like that's the worst trauma you can be in, right? You're the most critical, and you have a gunshot wound to the chest. Like usually a level 1's considered when you're having like a gunshot wound to very vital organs, the chest where your heart is, your lungs are, the abdomen where you have your aorta and large vessels that could cause you to bleed out without emergent intervention, and then some like in the legs where your femoral artery is and stuff like that. So anything that's going to cause you critical access and you need stabilizing immediately, and there's certain criteria to meet a level 1, but usually if it's in those areas, you do meet criteria. So if you come in and let's say it was a gunshot wound and the police were already with you because they were on scene at the time, then yes, the police have a need to know, and that's a mandated reporting. So we would cooperate with police investigation, and there's certain things that have to be done when it is like let's say it's a gun shootout or something like that, then, you have to be very careful about how you cut the clothes off of the patient. You have to bag them for evidence, stuff like that. And then there's certain protocols that you have to do to follow compliance with investigative, like the investigation that's going on. Like certain drug screens have to be a certain way just to see, so we have to follow protocol there as well. But with the EMTALA and patient care, you still have to stabilize the patient first. We're not just going to say, okay, take them to jail. No, you have to stabilize the patient, and police cannot interfere with the necessary medical care. So they couldn't come in and say, well, he's under arrest, I'm going to handcuff him to the bed. That can't be done if it's against their patient safety. So patient safety is always first, even though hospital staff are required to be compliant with the police investigation at that point. The third thing would be warrants and consent. So police cannot force entry into the ER or patient rooms without a warrant or exigent circumstances or the patient's consent. So for example, going back to what I said earlier, if you come in with a drug overdose, like we know drugs are illegal, we're not just automatically calling the police and saying, hey, you should know this person took so much fentanyl, right? Because that is going against the HIPAA Privacy Act, because it is your right for us to talk about that together as a collaborative team. That is not a reportable event to the police. So let's just, for example, say the police were already in the ER because of a level 1 trauma gunshot wound. So they were already there, and then they see someone they had a warrant for roll by. This does not give them immediate access to your care or what's going on with you. They are not allowed to forcefully enter your room and ask you questions because they don't have a warrant for the hospital. So I hope that makes sense. So just because a police officer has a warrant for a person and they happen to see them in the emergency room does not give them access to you because they did not go obtain a warrant to the hospital. So for example, a warrant for a person's arrest allows police to take them into custody after they are medically clear, but it does not give them access to medical records or details about their condition. So they cannot ask the nursing staff like, hey, did you do a drug screen on them? What did it say? Because the hospital staff are not required to answer that question because it is not about, even though they have a warrant for the person and they've been medically cleared, they do not have a warrant for the hospital and the medical records. So until they present with a warrant for hospital and medical records, then nursing staff are still not to break HIPAA. Okay, so that's how that works. But there are mandated things that have to be reported, and it's varied state by state. So I can only speak about Alabama since that's where I worked for most of my career. But in Alabama, emergency room personnel are legally required to report certain types of abuse. We already talked about the stab wounds and the gunshot wounds that are also mandated to be reporting. But the primary abuse that Alabama ERs are required to report is child abuse and neglect. So there's a Alabama code for this that healthcare professionals, including those in the ERs, must report any known or suspected cases of child abuse or neglect. That can include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, as well as neglect, such as failure to provide adequate food, medical treatment, clothing, or shelters. Reports should be made immediately by the telephone or direct communication and followed by a written report to the authorities. The second one is abuse, neglect, or exploitation of elderly or disabled adults. The Adult Protective Service Act of 1976 mandates that healthcare providers report any known or suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation of elderly or disabled adults. This includes physical harm, financial exploitation, or failure to provide necessary care. And then we talked about the gunshots and stab wounds. So when I said earlier, some states do burns, it's not on the Alabama reporting. So the gunshot and stab wounds it says while Alabama law does not explicitly require the reporting of gunshot and stab wounds by healthcare providers, it is common practice for hospitals to notify law enforcement when treating such injuries, especially if they are related to criminal activities, which is what we always did. Typically, when it was stuff like that, like level 1 traumas, gunshot wounds, the police were already there. Like sometimes they were bringing them in for medical care, and then sometimes they were following right behind the ambulance because they were on scene. So usually it's not even the fact that we have to report it. It's already been reported and they're there and we have to cooperate in the investigation. Another type of abuse Alabama law requires is domestic violence. It does say that Alabama law does not specifically mandate healthcare providers to report cases of domestic violence unless they involve injuries that fall under other mandatory reporting categories, such as child abuse or vulnerable adult abuse. However, healthcare providers are encouraged to offer support and resources to victims of domestic violence, which is typically what we do. If you are worried about domestic abuse, then you would get a social worker involved. You would get them like certain pamphlets or stuff like that. For example, if you do watch The Pit after listening to it, this is why I actually liked this show, because it had a really great example. There was someone that you could tell they were being abused by their employer, and whether it was, I think in this situation, they thought they were being human trafficked, but there was nothing they could do if the person didn't want help. Like, hey, give me 2 winks if you need help, But this person was adamant that she was fine, that her employer, quote unquote, employer was not abusing her, but she was just acting very strangely. And so this woman, kept trying. She even separated them by taking her to CAT scan and tried to talk to her individually. And the person was still adamant, like, no, I'm fine. There is nothing wrong. all this stuff, right? So you also have to do what the patient wants. So you can't force someone to get help if they don't want help, because then that's going against their rights as well. But you can try to talk to someone and do everything you can. So ultimately, she just handed her a pen that when the pen opened up, there was a phone number for a hotline to get help if you wanted it. So that way, it wasn't an obvious pamphlet on abuse, but there was a secret way to be like, hey, if you ever feel like you want to talk to someone and you're ready to talk to someone, here's a way to do that. But I want to look up specifically human trafficking in Alabama, because that is something else. I'm not sure if it's reportable or not, but let me look. Okay, so in Alabama, the law does not explicitly mandate healthcare providers to report suspected human trafficking cases involving adults. It is considered best practice to do so. Healthcare professionals are encouraged to report any suspicions of human trafficking to the appropriate authorities. So it's saying adults, so I'm not sure if it's minor. That goes back to child abuse and neglect. So you probably would be mandated, because all of this is intertwined. So that's why a lot of hospitals have social workers to let you know the rules and help you kind of navigate that. So if you're suspecting something, I know we would always go speak with our social workers to be like, hey, this is kind of off. Like, can you come help me talk to this patient? Can you help me follow the law? And there's so many people to help you. So those are the things that I know are reportable, where you have to follow, investigative reports and police officers. But the one where you absolutely do not is the one I spoke about earlier. So like I said, if you're a drug overdose or, you use drugs and you're having side effects, don't be afraid to go to the ER, because you're like, well, what if someone gets a hold of my medical records? They're not allowed to do that. They have to have a warrant for your medical records. Like we can't even call your job and say, hey, by the way, you should let so-and-so know that they do drugs. That's illegal with the HIPAA Act. So you wouldn't have to worry about that. So I hope that answers that question about the police enforcement in the hospital. Oh, one thing else I wanted to touch on, since I'm not getting too political. One day, again, maybe I'll sit down and talk about politics, but today's not the day. When it comes to immigration in the ER, if an illegal immigrant comes into an emergency room and then gets admitted to the hospital, ICE nor the police, like if they find out that someone is at the hospital and they're illegal immigrants, they cannot come in and ask about the patient. They cannot take the patient. Again, that goes against HIPAA, that goes against EMTALA, because EMTALA protects all patients. Hospitals must provide emergency care to anyone regarding immigration status, and that would fall under the HIPAA Act if because hospitals cannot share a patient's immigration status with law enforcement unless the patient consents. There is a valid warrant or subpoena for the medical records, or if there is a patient public safety threat due to this patient, like a suspected violent crime, like this person was shooting someone else, something like that. So hospitals are considered sensitive locations. So under ICE's sensitive locations policy, enforcement action should not take place in hospitals. Again, except in rare cases such as, public safety, national security threats, imminent danger, or if they have a warrant or subpoena to do so. So I know there was a lot of things going around recently about how ICE was invading hospitals, and healthcare workers were just letting them in and letting them know that the patients were there. This is actually illegal. So you need to look up the law in your specific state. This is specific to Alabama, but I'm pretty sure it's a federal law. So I would just make sure you're looking that up, because it doesn't say like per Alabama, it just says federally. So when it comes to working in the ER, hospitals do not have a legal duty to check or report a patient's immigration status. Asking about immigration status could discourage patients from seeking care. So we don't even ask. Like, that was never something we asked. We never knew at all, period. Someone's legal, not legal. We don't ask. We don't ask for, green cards. We don't ask for that. Most of the time, they ask for a driver's license if they have one. If they don't, and there's some people that are citizens that don't have their driver's license. Like, I know I went to the ER with my friend a few days ago to sit with her, and she forgot her driver's license at her house because obviously she needed to go to the ER. She was stressed out. She forgot her wallet on the counter and she didn't have it. And so it's not required to have those documents when you go into the ER. And we can't say, well, if you don't have this, we're not treating you, because again, we have to take care of every patient. So now I'll say, I hope I answered that question about the law enforcement in the hospital. That was a long-winded response. I'm sorry, but I just wanted to make sure I gave you factual information. And then the second question was, how do you handle a combative patient? So this could be nuanced. And again, you have to follow a hospital policy. Every hospital is going to be different. Our hospital offered a class called MOAB, which stands for Management of Aggressive Behavior. It's a training for hospital staff. Basically, you're trying to prevent or de-escalate an aggressive or violent situation or a combative patient before it gets to a level of where you're having to take, care. I will say that our hospital in particular would say that, if someone's being combative and you're doing everything to de-escalate or prevent it and they still become combative, that we're still not allowed to use, self-defense measures. Like, okay, if someone gets to me, punches me, like I'm not allowed then to punch back. That's just hospital policy. The policy is to call, security and try to get someone to, intervene, I guess. So a lot of times we would call security. A lot of the doctors, obviously are male, so they would come in and the male nurses would then, if they had to get the patient away, pin them down using MOAB techniques. They would pin them down, waiting for security to come, or get them back into the hospital bed and use restraints. Those type situations is how we handled it at our hospital. They just say that we're not supposed to use self-defense, and that's due to limitations, right? So there's still legal and ethical and professional standards, even though you're trying to defend yourself, so and I'll read off to you like the different things that they say for this reason. Number one would be duty of care versus self-defense. So healthcare workers have a duty of care to the patients, even if they are aggressive or violent. Unlike law enforcement, hospital staff are expected to use de-escalation techniques. That's why we have the MOAB training. Number two, there's legal and liability issues. Many hospitals prohibit staff from retaliating physically due to legal risks, and I know that was the case at our hospital. We were not allowed to retaliate physically. You cannot use force against a patient, even in self-defense, because it could potentially lead to lawsuits, to the hospital, termination of you from the hospital, or criminal charges, which is honestly crazy if you think about it. Because again, as last week when I used the example of, there's no other place of business that you can walk into and physically assault someone. But when it comes to medical care, there are certain things you just cannot do, because you cannot turn someone away from medical care, because that's a whole liability in itself. And then sometimes patients are being aggressive or agitative or combative because it is a medical reason. Like, so for example, sometimes if you're having a head bleed, you are a completely different person and you could become combative or whatnot very easily. There was one time I was working, which we were very fortunate because it was, so we were working and a patient came in unconscious, and when someone comes in unconscious, you have to, go through your differential list. Like, is this a drug overdose? Is it electrolyte abnormality? You just kind of have to go through your differentials. So the first thing and the quickest thing and easiest thing to do is give some Narcan, just see if they wake up, which is going to counteract any opioid. It's not going to counteract benzos, but it'll counteract the opioid, and then they're going to wake up, and then you've solved the issue. They're now awake, and then you just have to monitor them, right? So that's the quickest and easiest way to test that theory without waiting on a UDS to come, which is a urine drug screen. And so this one time we gave Narcan to a patient, and because he came in unconscious and he didn't go through, walk in through the ER where there was metal detectors. And when you're a critical patient, obviously you're not going to stop and be wand down by security because you're unconscious and you need ventilation support, respiratory support, because you don't know what's going on at that moment. And he came in by ambulance. And so that was the first thing we did. We do like we do, cut the clothes off, put the IVs in, put them on the cardiac monitor. And then the first thing we did was, hey, let's give some Narcan, see if it wakes him up. If not, then we're moving on to the next step, which is intubation, trying to figure out the cause, right? So this patient we gave Narcan to immediately woke up, didn't know where he was, so he was terrified. And unfortunately for us, he had a gun in his pocket, and that's immediately where he went to grab. But fortunately for us, security was there and was immediately able to stop before anything occurred. So sometimes when patients are combative or aggressive, there could be an underlying medical cause, like, if they don't know why they're there and we wake them up. If it's a psychiatric patient, like a true schizophrenic, bipolar, and it's something that they cannot control. But then again, there are some patients that are just combative because they're mad at the staff, they're mad at the wait times, and again, still not. And again, it all goes back to hospital policy, but I would assume 99% of hospitals are going to say you cannot physically retaliate. So the third one, again, since we're going through this checklist, is hospital policy and training focusing on de-escalations, which most hospitals use the MOAB that I talked about. There's another training called CPI, which is Crisis Prevention Institute. And then there is PMAB, Prevention and Management of Aggressive Behavior. And all of these are just working and teaching you, de-escalation techniques, calling security, and then using safe restraint methods, which is typically what we did. Like, again, you try to de-escalate them. You're not going to start yelling back. Like if they're yelling profanities at you, you're not going to turn around and start doing the same thing because that's going to agitate them even more. This is where you have to really focus on patience and not worrying about what someone is saying about you. Sometimes you have to turn around and walk out and just shut the door and let them calm down. Maybe it's sometimes getting a new nurse because y'all just aren't jiving. But if it does get to that physical point, that's when you have to and usually if someone's starting to yell, we immediately call security. So we're not waiting until they're physical because then security is there and they have different policies for them because it's security and law enforcement at that point. Our particular ER always had a law enforcement agent on duty. Well, I wouldn't say always, but most of the time. Most of the time there was a law enforcement agent that sat at the front, in triage, and kind of just monitor people coming in and out. And if things went south, they would come with security. And number 4, the reason why we can't is because it's security and law enforcement role. So most hospitals expect staff to call security or police instead of using force, because security teams have different policies and they are trained to physically intervene when necessary. And then exceptions when self-defense may be justified would be if a patient is actively assaulting a nurse and there is no other escape. Minimal and reasonable force to protect oneself may be allowed, but this would have to be your only option, pretty much. Self-defense must be proportional, like blocking or escaping rather than striking back. So sometimes that's what we would have to do. Sometimes it's you run as fast as you can, you get out of the room, and you shut the doors and leave them in the room to destroy the room and not someone else. Sometimes we use that tactic as well. Some states provide workplace violence protections for healthcare workers, but the laws vary. So that's the explanation on that question. I hope that answers. I know it's not direct, but it's just crazy because we know that there is a lot of nurse abuse out there and these policies are in place, but I can understand them because of it being different than just walking into a restaurant or Walmart or something like that. But at the same time, it's you also sometimes fear for your safety at your job, and who wants to do that? And then the last question was, how do you handle a patient transferred from jail or prison? So basically, you're just going to handle them like you would any other patient, right? So you're going to treat them with respect. You are going to protect their HIPAA rights, their EMTALA rights, any other rights that they have while they're in the hospital. And you're just going to treat them like they're any other person. And sometimes it's scary. Sometimes, you have people coming in from prison for, Capital One murder, and you're scared, but there's always a police officer with them. So the police officer stays in the room with them or right outside the door with them. Usually they have them handcuffed either at both ankles or, one wrist to the stretcher, unless it's something where that has to come off. Like if they're having seizures, or let's say they got in a fight in jail and now they need stitches, and it's actually, and the handcuffs are then going to prevent, or if the handcuffs become a safety issue. So if it's a safety issue, those have to go. We can use soft restraints if needed. But you just treat them like anyone else. And most of the time they're very nice. They're, just like any other patient, and you have to just treat them and that's one thing about being a nurse, right? And that's one of the things that I talked to the other day. It was a political statement with a friend. My job, no matter what my politics are, no matter what my religion is, no matter what my belief system is, you have to check it at the door. Being in healthcare, you do not deny care. You do not treat someone differently just because of the color of their skin, the religion they believe in, if their immigration status is illegal or not. You treat everyone the same. And if you can't do that, then you should not be in healthcare, in my personal opinion, because everyone deserves the same respect when it comes to treating them and trying to find out their diagnosis. And that goes for like if you do or don't have insurance. Like, we're not going to not see you. We're not going to deny your care. We're not going to not run tests unless you ask. So some patients will be like, hey, I don't have insurance. Can we keep the testing to minimum? And then you're respecting their boundaries, but you're also providing care. So you just, for that question, that you just treat them like any other person, like you would if they weren't in custody or in jail. So I hope that answers all your questions. Again, I appreciate the fan mail that you sent in. If anyone else has any more questions or wants me to continue this type of content, then definitely shoot me some fan mail or go to my Instagram. So that's what it's called. It's called fan mail. But if you go like to the actual episode on whatever platform you're listening to, you just click on the episode and scroll to the bottom, and there's like a purple link. Well, this is the Apple app. There's a purple link that says you can now send us a text to ask a question. So you just click on that and it takes you to the place where it would text and it sends it to me via email. And again, it's completely anonymous, so I don't even know who it is. It just tells me like, hey, this person from Tennessee is asking these questions. So if you want, again, like I said at the beginning, if you want me to know who you are and you want me to give you a shout out, happy to do that. Just send me an Instagram link, which my Instagram link is in the show notes as well, or a direct message, and I will do my best to get all your questions answered. Sometimes I'm not the expert. It would have been great if I had a law enforcement agent on here with me to kind of discuss this with me, but by the time I sat down, I do have a friend that is a police officer that would have gladly sat down and talked about this episode with me, but time constraints and stuff like that. So I hope that I answered all your questions without boring you to death, and I hope that I answered them all accurately. If I misspoke at any point, I do apologize. I can only speak from my personal experience and the research that I conducted prior to this episode. So as always, guys, thank you for listening, and until next time, bye.